Martha stood at the threshold of the creaky wooden chapel, her fingers trembling as she adjusted the lace veil draped over her shoulders. The scent of dust and wild roses clung to the air, mingling with the earthy musk of sweat and cattle that seeped from the guests gathered outside. The frontier settlement was a harsh place, where survival bred judgment and gossip traveled quicker than a prairie fire. She took a deep breath, her chest heaving against the tight fabric of her dress. It was a fine dress, finer than she'd ever imagined owning, stitched by her own hands from a bolt of white muslin she'd bartered for months ago. It fit snugly over her broad hips and full chest, a testament to her hours hunched over a sewing needle, her fingers pricked raw by ambition and hope. Yet the voices from beyond the chapel walls gnawed at her composure. Whispers rose and fell. Like the rustling of leaves, each word sharper than the last. They spoke of her size, her supposed unworthiness, of Tom's foolishness for choosing her. Martha's jaw clenched, her fingers tightening around the bouquet of dried lavender and sage she had clutched to her chest. Tom had always been the charming one, quick with a smile and quicker still with his promises. He'd courted her with the kind of intensity that left her both breathless and bewildered. A man like him could have had any woman in the settlement, and yet he'd chosen her. Or so she'd believed. The chapel door swung open, the sudden gust of wind tugging at her, veil and sweeping her hair into disarray. Her father's weathered face appeared, eyes downcast. She could see the shame etched into his features, deep grooves that matched her own apprehension. "He's waiting," her father muttered, his voice gravelly from years of tobacco and disappointment. He turned and walked away before she could muster a response, his boots crunching against the brittle dirt. Martha stepped forward, her legs stiff and awkward as she crossed the threshold into the sunlight. The crowd parted around her, their eyes darting between her and the man waiting beneath the makeshift altar. Tom's shoulders were rigid, his gaze fixed on the ground as if the sight of her might turn him to stone. The preacher began to speak, his voice a low drone that drifted over the assembled crowd. Martha scarcely heard him. Her attention was fixed on Tom's expression, his clenched jaw and darting eyes. When the preacher asked Tom if he would take her as his wife, Tom's hesitation stretched like a shadow over the dry earth. He looked at her, his blue eyes narrowing with something that twisted her stomach. Disgust? Fear? Whatever it was, it stole the air from her lungs. "I can't do this." Tom's voice broke through the stillness like a gunshot. I thought I could, but look at her, she's too fat. I can't marry someone who looks like that." The silence that followed was brutal, slicing through Martha's chest with the precision of a knife. The crowd erupted, their murmurs turning to laughter, to scornful taunts disguised as jokes. Words like cow and hog drifted toward her, each one leaving a sting worse than the last. Martha's throat tightened, her vision blurring. She wanted to speak, to lash out, to crumble into the dust and let the earth swallow her whole. But no words came, only a hollow ache that spread from her chest to her trembling fingers. Tom turned away from her, his expression twisted with contempt. He stormed off, his boots kicking up clouds of dirt as he pushed past the onlookers. Some followed him, their laughter trailing behind like scavenging birds. Martha stood alone beneath the altar, her hands shaking so violently she nearly dropped the bouquet. The preacher shifted awkwardly, his eyes avoiding hers. No one moved, to comfort her, to speak on her behalf. Even her father had disappeared into the crowd, his shame too great to allow him to remain. The first tear fell, hot and humiliating against her cheek. Her own sorrow tasted bitter, a rage simmering beneath her grief. She had worked so hard, believed so fiercely that this was her chance at happiness, but it had all crumbled beneath Tom's cruelty and the town's laughter. "Looks like you need a new groom," came a voice from the edge of the crowd, rough and threaded with amusement. "Lucky for you, I'm not so particular." Martha turned, her gaze locking onto a man she had only seen in passing, a drifter named Jed, known for his sharp wit and sharper gun. His presence was like a gust of wind cutting through the stifling air. Broad-shouldered and lean, his face was etched with lines of hardship and humor, his dark eyes gleaming with something she couldn't quite place. Jed stepped forward, his hand resting easily on the butt of his pistol. If you're willing, I'd be happy to take you off their hands, unless you'd rather stay here and let them chew you up like coyotes on a carcass." The crowd tittered, their attention shifting from her humiliation to this unexpected spectacle. Martha's cheeks burned, her anger flaring at Jed's nonchalance. Yet there was something about his gaze that held her steady, as if he were daring her to reclaim her pride. "You jest," Martha said, her voice cracking. The words tasted of salt and grit. "You can't be serious." "I don't waste words," Jed replied. "They all want to tear you down, but I reckon you've got more grit than the lot of them combined. So what's it gonna be? Stand here and let them laugh, or come with me and show them you're worth more than their sorry opinions?" Martha stared at him, her heart pounding with something foreign and fierce. Defiance. It surged through her veins like wildfire, scorching away the shame and leaving only a sharp-edged determination. "If you're willing to take me," she said, her voice steadier than she'd expected, "then I'll go with you." A ripple of shock spread through the crowd, their amusement giving way to murmurs of disbelief. Jed grinned, a flash of white teeth against his weathered face. He tipped his hat to her, his gaze glinting with approval. "Good choice," he said. "And now let's get the hell out of here before they decide to burn us both at the stake for ruining their fine little spectacle." He offered her his arm, and Martha took it without hesitation. Together, they strode through the parted crowd, their steps steady and unyielding. The whispers followed them, laced with resentment and awe, but Martha kept her chin high, her spine straight. They walked past the edge of the settlement, the dry air crisp and stinging against her cheeks. Her heart thundered in her chest, but for the first time it wasn't with fear. Jed led her toward his horse, the beast's coat gleaming like polished copper beneath the harsh sun. As he helped her into the saddle, Jed's gaze met hers. "They'll keep talking, you know. Might even send someone after us if they're feeling ornery." "Let them try," Martha said, her voice cool and sharp as a knife's edge. "I'm done caring what they think." Jed laughed, the sound rich and unguarded. "I like your fire, woman. This might just turn out interesting after all." And with that, they rode away from the settlement, the dust kicking up behind them like ghosts of the past they were leaving behind. The trail was rough and unyielding, a winding scar etched into the parched landscape. Martha clung to the saddle, her fingers clenched tightly around the leather reins. Her thighs ached from the constant jostling, but she refused to complain. The shame she'd left behind still throbbed in her chest like a fresh wound, and pride kept her from revealing any sign of weakness. Jed rode ahead, his posture easy and assured, like a man who'd spent more years in the saddle than on solid ground. He whistled occasionally, a low meandering tune that rose and fell like the wind skimming over the prairie. It grated on her nerves at first, that casual indifference, but the sound gradually became a thread of normalcy in the harsh quiet. Dust swirled around them, the sun searing the backs of their necks with its merciless intensity. Martha's mouth felt dry as bone, her skin prickling beneath the layered fabric of her dress. She cursed herself for not preparing better, for letting herself be caught in the whirlwind of humiliation and rage without even a canteen of water. Jed's horse, a muscular bay gelding with a dark mane tangled from neglect, moved with the sure-footedness of a creature accustomed to hardship. Martha's own mount, a borrowed mare Jed had secured from the outskirts of the settlement, was skittish and uncooperative, her nerves seemingly mirroring Martha's own. "You keep twisting up your face like that and it'll stick," Jed called. Over his shoulder, his voice carrying easily over the dry air. "Or maybe that's just how you always look." Martha scowled at his back, her patience already fraying. "You're awfully chatty for a man who claims to hate company." "Didn't say I hated company. Just said most folks ain't worth the trouble." He cast a glance over his shoulder, eyes glinting with amusement. "You, though, you might be worth the trouble, still figuring that out." She bit down a retort, unwilling to give him the satisfaction. Instead, she focused on the rough terrain, her eyes scanning for any sign of danger. Bandits roamed these parts, and the occasional wildcat or wolf could be just as deadly. It struck her that she was alone with a man she hardly knew, trusting him with her life, simply because he'd extended a hand when she was drowning in humiliation. "Why'd you do it?" she asked finally, her voice cutting through the brittle air. "Why offer to marry me? You don't even know me." Jed shrugged, his shoulders rolling like he was brushing off an errant fly. Maybe I like the idea of a challenge. Or maybe I just don't like watching a pack of hyenas tearing into someone who can't fight back. I could have fought back, Martha snapped, her indignation flaring hot and fierce. Just because I didn't doesn't mean I couldn't, he chuckled, the sound rich and unguarded. There's that fire. I was starting to worry you left it behind with the rest of your pretty words. They rode in silence for a while, the heat baking the earth beneath their horses' hooves. Martha found herself studying Jed's profile, the sharp angles softened by a week's worth of stubble. He looked older than she'd first thought, lines etched around his eyes like the marks of a cartographer tracing his way through pain and hardship. The first night they made camp near a shallow creek, the water cool and clear against Martha's aching feet. Jed built a fire with practiced efficiency, his hands moving with the surety of experience. Martha watched him from the other side of the flames, her own hands trembling slightly as she unwrapped the meager provisions she'd managed to gather before leaving the settlement. Jed's gaze flicked to her, sharp and assessing. You always that skittish? Or is it just me that makes you jump? I'm not skittish, Martha replied, her voice steady but low, just cautious. You'd be too if your life had been torn apart by the same people you grew up alongside. Life's got a way of doing that, he said with a shrug. People are worse than wolves sometimes. At least wolves are honest about their hunger. The fire crackled between them, the night air cooling to a bearable chill. Martha tugged her shawl tighter around her shoulders, her eyes darting to the shadows that danced beyond the fire's reach. She couldn't shake the feeling of being watched, the weight of unseen eyes pressing against her skin like icy fingers. You worried about bandits? Jed asked, his voice softer now, edged with something that resembled concern. Wouldn't be the first time I've been warned about them, Martha admitted. Out here, it feels like anything could happen, and not all of it good. Smart. Woman, he said with a nod. But you don't have to worry, not while I'm around. What makes you so sure you can protect me? She challenged, her chin tilting defiantly. Jed grinned, his teeth white against the grime of the trail. I'm still here, ain't I? Haven't been shot, stabbed, or starved to death yet. That's got to count for something. Martha couldn't help but snort, a sound that startled her as much as it seemed to amuse him. It was the first time she'd laughed since the wedding, if that disaster could even be called a wedding. The sound was rough, rusty, like a tool, left forgotten in the rain. They continued their journey the next morning, the landscape rolling out before them in endless waves of ochre and sage. Jed led with an easy confidence, his eyes constantly scanning the horizon. Martha followed, her own gaze straying to the shifting shadows and distant ridges. By the third day, the ache in her legs had settled into a dull throb she could mostly ignore. Her skin had darkened beneath the relentless sun, freckles speckling her cheeks and arms. Despite the discomfort, she found herself growing accustomed to the rhythm of the journey, the creak of saddles, the steady thud of hooves against hardened earth. One afternoon, as they navigated a rocky slope, Martha's horse stumbled, its hoof catching on a loose stone. She lurched forward, nearly toppling from the saddle before she managed to right herself. Careful, Jed called back, his voice tight. Wouldn't do to break your neck before we even reach my homestead. I'm fine, Martha replied, through gritted teeth. But her heart still pounded, the near fall rattling her composure. They made camp that evening beneath the sprawling arms of an ancient cottonwood tree. Jed handed her a tin plate filled with salted pork and beans, his expression unreadable as she accepted the food. You did good today, he said, his tone casual. Better than I expected. Martha bristled, her pride rankling at the implication. I'm not some delicate flower you need to coddle. I've noticed, Jed replied with a grin. But you're still a city girl trying to find her way. In the wild. Nothing wrong with admitting you've got some learning to do. Martha's retort died on her tongue. There was truth in his words, whether she liked it or not. And she had a feeling that if she was to survive this new life, she'd need to learn more than she already knew. They sat in silence, the fire's warmth seeping into their bones. For the first time since the ordeal began, Martha allowed herself to feel something other than anger or shame. She let herself feel hope. The journey ahead was long, the dangers real, but she was still standing. And as she glanced across the fire at Jed's inscrutable face, She realized that maybe, just maybe, she wasn't as alone as she had once feared. The days bled into weeks as Martha settled into the rhythm of life at Jed's homestead. The cabin, rough-hewn from pine logs and patched over the years with whatever materials Jed could scavenge, sat nestled against the curve of a shallow valley. It was a crude shelter, but sturdier than it appeared. The land stretched around them, wild and untamed, its beauty marred only by the scars of drought and the occasional roving predator. Martha's hands bore the proof of her labor: blisters, calluses, cuts from tangled wire and splintered wood. Her arms ached at the end of each day, her muscles stiff and stubborn. But she never complained, not even when the relentless sun seared her skin or when her fingers trembled from exhaustion. There was pride in the work, a satisfaction she hadn't expected. Jed was a relentless taskmaster, his instructions gruff but clear. He taught her how to build fences, repair tools, even shoot a rifle. Her aim was poor at first, the recoil bruising her shoulder and rattling her nerves, but her determination only hardened, each failure driving her to practice until her hands steadied and her eye grew sharper. "Good," Jed remarked one evening as she struck a tin can clean off a fence post from 20 paces. "You're a quick learner when you stop worrying about looking proper." Martha flashed him a glare, but her lips twitched with the ghost of a smile. She'd grown used to his teasing, his dry humor, the way he watched her with an intensity that bordered on curiosity. He never spoke of his past, nor did she press him. They had both come to this place burdened with ghosts, and it seemed an unspoken agreement to let them rest. In the quiet moments, when the work was done and the fire crackled softly between them, Martha found herself studying him. The way his hands moved with practiced ease, mending a bridle or sharpening a blade. The furrow of his brow when he considered something deeply, the way he seemed to listen more than speak, his gaze always drifting toward the horizon, as if expecting some distant threat to rise out of the dust. They ate simple meals, bread hard as stone, beans boiled with whatever scraps of meat Jed managed to hunt or trade for. Martha took over the cooking soon enough, her skill with spices and flavors surprising even herself. Jed devoured her meals with the same gusto he approached his work, offering only the occasional nod of approval. It wasn't until a particularly cold night, when the wind howled like a beast starved for flesh, that Martha dared ask him what had been gnawing at her for weeks. "Why did you leave the settlement?" she asked, her voice steady despite the hesitation coiled in her gut. "You could have stayed there, found work or trade. Why this?" She gestured around them, the rough cabin walls, the desolate land stretched beyond. Jed's gaze remained, fixed on the fire, the orange glow painting his features in harsh lines. "Same reason you left, I reckon. Didn't fit where I was, figured I'd make a place where I did." She waited, half expecting him to cut the conversation short as he so often did. But something about the darkness beyond the cabin's thin walls seemed to loosen his tongue. "I used to ride with a gang," he continued, his voice flat and devoid of pride. "We weren't the worst of the lot, but we weren't saints either. Robbed banks, trains, whatever paid. Was good at it too." He glanced at her then, his eyes like chips of flint. But good don't always mean right. Martha remained, silent, her fingers clenched around the cup of coffee she held. She'd guessed he had a past worth hiding, but to hear it confirmed was like a stone dropped into a deep well. "One job went bad," Jed said, his gaze drifting again. "Folks. Died who shouldn't have. Good folks. I rode off that day and never looked back. Came out here thinking maybe I could make something worth having. Something that didn't come from stealing it off someone else." Martha nodded slowly, the weight of his words settling over her. "You did. This place, it's rough, sure, but it's yours. You built it. Building ain't the same as making something last." His tone was bitter, but there was a hint of something else, hope perhaps, or the stubborn remnants of it. They fell into silence again, but it was a different kind of quiet, one that carried understanding instead of avoidance. Martha found herself admiring his resilience, the way he carried his guilt like a scar that hadn't quite healed but refused to fester. It wasn't long before they settled into a routine, their days marked by toil and their nights by conversation. Jed taught her how to mend fences and hunt small game. Martha showed him how to plant herbs and vegetables, the green shoots pushing through the earth like tiny promises. Their partnership grew, the lines between necessity and companionship blurring until Martha could no longer distinguish one from the other. Jed was rough-edged, yes, but he was also patient in ways she hadn't expected. He corrected her mistakes with a gentleness that belied his gruff demeanor, his humor emerging like sun through clouds. One evening, as they worked side by side repairing the barn's roof, Jed turned to her with a rare, unguarded expression. "You're stronger than you think, you know. Most folks would have quit by now, gone running back to the comfort of town." "I'm not most folks," Martha replied, the words carrying more conviction than she'd realized she possessed. "And I'm not going back, not ever." Jed's smile was small, almost wistful. "Didn't think you would. You've got a spine made of steel." The compliment settled warmly in her chest, but it was his gaze that held her attention. The way he looked at her, not with pity or expectation, but with something closer to respect. Their routine continued, the days sharpening her muscles and her resolve. She grew accustomed to the aches and bruises, her hands toughening against the roughness of labor. It was hard work, but it was hers. And with each task completed, her confidence bloomed like the flowers she coaxed from the stubborn earth. She was mending a section of the corral one afternoon when a figure appeared on the horizon, staggering through the dust with all the grace of a wounded animal. Martha's breath caught in her throat as she recognized him. Tom. He was thinner than she remembered, his face hollowed by hardship. His eyes were wild, darting about like a man hunted by his own failures. He stumbled toward the homestead, his voice a rasped plea. "Martha, please, I made a mistake. I was wrong. God help me, I was wrong." She stood frozen, her hands clenched at her sides. All the pain he'd caused, all the shame and anger, rose up within her like a storm. But beneath the fury was something stronger, something tempered by weeks of struggle and growth. Tom's gaze met hers, desperate and broken. "Take me back, Martha. I'll do right by you. I swear it." Martha's voice was calm, unyielding. "I don't need you, Tom. Not anymore." His expression crumbled, the weight of her words crashing over him like a wave. He stumbled backward, his retreat clumsy and graceless. Martha watched him go, her chest light and her spine straight. The land stretched around her, vast and wild. But for the first time it felt like home. The following morning dawned cool and clear, the sky a pale wash of blue stretched over the expanse of dry earth. Martha awoke before the sun had fully crested the hills, her body aching from the previous day's labor, but her mind sharp and alert. The echo of Tom's desperate voice still clung to her, but she shook it off with the same force she used to yank weeds from her struggling garden. She had planted potatoes and squash, coaxed seedlings to sprout in the rough soil with a patience she never knew she possessed. The act of nurturing something fragile until it gained strength and flourished had become its own sort of salvation. She bent over the rows, fingers probing the soil to check the moisture, her thoughts as methodical as her hands. Jed appeared from the barn, his rifle slung across his shoulder, his gaze already surveying the horizon with that practiced wariness. They had grown comfortable with each other's presence, their words no longer guarded or clipped. There was a rhythm between them now, a familiarity woven from countless shared tasks and quiet conversations by the fire. Martha's eyes met his, and she offered a nod. Jed returned the gesture, his expression as unreadable as ever, but his approval clear enough. She found herself measuring her progress against his expectations, a habit she couldn't quite explain or shake. The morning's peace fractured with a sudden shout from beyond the ridge. Jed's head snapped toward the sound, his entire frame coiled with tension. Martha straightened, her hands smeared with dirt, her heartbeat accelerating with the certainty that trouble had come calling. Jed's rifle was in his hands before she could draw breath. He moved like a predator, swift and silent, his gaze fixed on the line of scrub where the shout had come from. Martha hesitated only a moment before retrieving her own weapon, the rifle Jed had insisted she learn to use. Her fingers trembled as she checked the chamber, but her resolve held firm. They crept forward together, Jed's presence a steadying force at her side. The terrain dipped into a shallow gully, the ground littered with twisted roots and dry brush. As they neared the ridge, the source of the disturbance became clear. 3 men stood clustered around a fallen horse, their voices raised in agitation. They were rough-looking, their clothes torn and filthy, their eyes hungry. Bandits, Martha guessed, though desperation had likely driven them farther from the main trails than they would have preferred. Jed held up a hand, signaling her to stay back, but she ignored him, her jaw set in defiance. She wouldn't hide behind him. Not now. Not after everything she'd endured. The bandits hadn't yet noticed them, their attention fixed on their own squabbling. "What's the plan?" she whispered, her voice low and tight. Jed's gaze flicked toward her, his eyes sharp with frustration but not surprise. "The plan is, you get back to the cabin. Let me handle this." "No," she replied, her fingers gripping the rifle with a steadiness she hadn't known she possessed. "We handle this together." His expression shifted, the protest dying on his tongue. Whatever argument he might have made was lost beneath the crack of a gunshot. The bandits had seen them. The world erupted into chaos. Jed returned fire with a precision that spoke of years spent surviving encounters just like this. Martha pressed herself to the ground, her breath coming in shallow bursts as she sighted down the barrel of her rifle. She squeezed the trigger, the recoil jolting through her shoulder, but her aim true. One of the bandits cried out, his weapon clattering to the ground as he clutched his bleeding arm. The noise sent the others scattering, their shots wild and frenzied. Martha's pulse hammered in her ears, but her focus narrowed to a knife's edge. She fired again, missing her target by inches but forcing the bandit to dive for cover. Jed moved like a shadow, his movements fluid and calculated. 2 of the men were down, the third fleeing with a limp that betrayed an injury. "Let him go," Jed muttered, his voice rough and breathless. "He's no threat now." Martha lowered her rifle, her hands shaking from more than just exertion. She watched the man's retreating figure until he was nothing more than a dark smudge against the endless horizon. Jed turned to her, his gaze searching. "You did good. Kept your head when most would have lost theirs." "I had to," she replied, her voice steadier than she expected. "This is my home too." The words hung between them, heavy and undeniable. Jed's expression softened, a flicker of something unguarded passing over his features. Respect, maybe. Or perhaps something deeper. They spent the rest of the day burying the dead, their bodies left nameless and unclaimed by the wilderness. Martha worked alongside Jed without complaint, her muscles straining under the weight of the shovels, but her determination unyielding. As the sun sank toward the horizon, painting the sky in shades of amber and crimson, they stood together over the fresh graves. Martha's hands were blistered and raw, her hair matted with sweat and dust. But there was a peace in her exhaustion, a sense of accomplishment she hadn't realized she craved. "Why didn't you leave?" Jed asked abruptly, his gaze fixed on the horizon. "When Tom showed up, when those men showed up, why stay?" "Because I've already run away once," Martha replied, her voice firm. "And because I'm not afraid of hard work, or of facing what comes my way. Not anymore." He glanced at her then, his eyes reflecting the dying light. "You've changed, grown stronger. Maybe I was always strong," she countered. "Just didn't know it until now." A faint smile tugged at his lips. "I reckon you might be right about that." They returned to the cabin in silence, the air cool and sweet with the scent of earth and pine. Martha washed the grime from her hands and prepared a simple meal, her movements slow but precise. Jed watched her with a curiosity that bordered on reverence, as if seeing her for the first time. As they ate, their conversation drifted to practical matters, repairs needed, supplies running low, plans for the coming winter. But beneath the mundane details was an unspoken understanding that neither dared voice. That night, as the fire burned low and the cabin settled into quiet, Jed spoke softly from his place across the room. "You saved my life today." "You've saved mine more than once," she replied, her tone matter-of-fact. "Seems only fair." "Fair's got nothing to do with it." His voice was rough, as if the words had been dragged from him by force. "You stayed, and you fought. Not just for this place, but for yourself. That matters." Martha met his gaze, her chest tight with a sudden overwhelming certainty. "I'm not going anywhere, Jed. Not unless you tell me to." He shook his head, a rueful smile twisting his lips. "Wouldn't dream of it." Martha closed her eyes and let the fire's warmth seep into her bones. The world outside remained as wild and unforgiving as ever, but she had found something worth fighting for within its bounds. She had found herself, and maybe, just maybe, she had found something else too. Hannah's breath tore from her chest in ragged bursts, the frigid air scalding her lungs as she ran. Bare feet sliced against rocks and twigs, but she felt nothing except the wild, urgent drive to keep moving. To be still meant capture, and capture meant death, or worse. She clutched the fraying hem of her dress, the once pristine fabric now smeared with dirt and torn by thorns. Her hair, loosed from its pins, whipped across her face, a tangled mane that stung her eyes as she stumbled. Through the underbrush, the forest pressed around her, the skeletal branches of oaks and elms scratching against the night sky. Moonlight flickered fitfully through the leaves, offering scant illumination as she pushed deeper into the wilderness. Water roared in the distance, a river swollen from spring rains. The sound bolstered her, promised some means of escape. She had to reach it. Behind her, the pounding of hooves echoed like gunfire, closing the distance between them. Voices barked through the night, harsh commands, brutish laughter. Her husband's voice rose above them all, guttural and cruel. He had never been a man to mask his violence with charm. His anger was naked and sharp-edged, and it had cut her more than once. "Find her," he howled, the words slashing through the darkness. "She's mine, and I'll have her back or see her rotting where she stands." She had known he would. Come after her. But the speed and fury with which he had set out to reclaim her left her reeling. She had underestimated his pride, his obsession. A runaway wife was an insult he could not abide, a stain on his name that had to be eradicated. She was no more than property to him, an object to be owned, controlled, broken if necessary. Her flight had begun at dawn, slipping from the house as the first pale light bled across the horizon. She had planned her escape for months, gathering what little she could without raising suspicion. Bread stolen from the pantry, a flask filled with tepid water. It wasn't enough, but anything more would have drawn his attention. The nights before her escape had been filled with silence and sleeplessness. Her body coiled tight beneath the sheets as he slumbered beside her. Each breath she took had been calculated, each movement cautious. His temper was a fickle thing, ignited by the slightest provocation. She had learned to navigate it, to endure his rages in silence, until endurance became impossible. The first blow had been struck within weeks of their wedding, a fist across her jaw for daring to question his commands. Then another and another, until the bruises became familiar as old friends. He hadn't always been cruel. His letters had been charming, his promises sweet. But the man who had written them was not the man who had met her at the train station. His eyes had been cold, calculating even then. And though his smile had been wide, it had never reached his eyes. It took her only days to realize her mistake. But by then it was too late. She was his wife in name and law, bound by vows that had become a cage. And when the cage became too tight, she had broken it apart with her bare hands. Now the sound of the river grew louder, its churning waters a frantic pulse in the darkness. She stumbled down a steep bank, her feet sinking into the mud as she neared the edge. The river was wide, the current fierce and unrelenting. Crossing it would be madness. But so was staying where she was. She hesitated only a moment before plunging into the icy water. The chill hit her like a fist, stealing her breath. The current tore at her limbs, dragged her down until she was thrashing, fighting to stay afloat. Her muscles screamed as she flailed, lungs burning as she gulped down air between ragged gasps. But she kept moving, kept struggling against the river's might. A gunshot cracked through the night, the sound sharp and furious. Water splashed beside her as the bullet struck the surface. She didn't dare look back, her focus narrowed to the opposite shore. Another shot, and another. They were firing blindly now, their aim lost to the darkness and her own frantic movements. She reached the far bank with her fingers scraped raw and her legs trembling. Clawing her way from the water, she collapsed onto the muddy shore, coughing and choking on the river's icy residue. For a long moment she lay there, gasping and shaking, her body pressed to the earth as if hoping to merge with it. Her husband's voice rang out once more, furious and distant. She's gone. No one could have survived that current. Pack it. Harp man, we head back. She waited. Her breath held until her lungs ached. It wasn't until the crunch of hooves faded into silence that she dared to rise. Her clothes clung to her body, sodden and heavy. Her fingers trembled as she pushed. Wet strands of hair from her eyes. She had escaped. The realization struck her like a bolt of lightning, both electrifying and terrifying. For the first time since she had boarded the train to this God-forsaken place, she was truly free. No walls to hold her, no fists to break her. Only the night, and the wild, unending world spread before her. But freedom was not safety. She was lost, her supplies ruined by the river's relentless force. Cold gnawed at her bones, the chill more vicious now that her body was soaked. She had no idea where she was, no sense of direction beyond the primal instinct to keep moving. The forest loomed around her, a labyrinth of shadows and half-formed shapes. Every rustle of leaves, every crack of a branch, sent her nerves fraying. She stumbled forward, driven less by purpose than by fear. It wasn't until the moonlight broke through a gap in the trees that she saw him. He stood at the edge of a clearing, his form shadowed but unmistakably human. Tall and broad-shouldered, with hair that fell past his shoulders like a dark river. His stance was poised, watchful, a predator's patience tempered by something else. Curiosity, perhaps. Anna froze, her breath catching in her throat. The man regarded her with an intensity that made her feel suddenly, achingly aware of her own vulnerability. She was alone, weaponless, stripped of everything but the will to survive. Yet there was something in his gaze that held her rooted to the spot. A stillness that defied the chaos she had just escaped. He took a step forward, his movement smooth and deliberate. She flinched, instinct screaming at her to run. But her legs refused to obey, the exhaustion of her flight crashing down upon her, like the river's relentless current. He spoke then, his voice low and calm. Words she couldn't understand, but the tone was unmistakable. Kindness, not the false gentleness of a man trying to lure her back to captivity, but something genuine. Anna's shoulders sagged, the last of her strength spent. She sank to her knees, her gaze locked with his. Whether he meant her harm or help, she no longer had the energy to care. The darkness pressed in, her vision blurring as her body yielded to exhaustion. The last thing she saw before consciousness fled was the stranger's face, his expression unreadable as he knelt beside her. Anna awoke to the sensation of warmth pressing against her skin, a sharp contrast to the chill that had seeped into her bones the night before. Her eyes fluttered open, the world swimming in and out of focus as she struggled to remember where she was. The forest, the river, the man. She stiffened, awareness flooding her senses with sudden, violent clarity. She lay upon a blanket woven from thick wool, the material rough but blessedly warm. Nearby, a fire crackled with soft, steady life, its flames licking at dry branches arranged with meticulous care. The rich scent of burning cedar filled the air, mingling with the earthy tang of the forest. And there, sitting across the fire, his gaze steady and unyielding, was the man who had found her. He regarded her with the same calm intensity she remembered from the night before. Dark eyes framed by high cheekbones and strong features, his hair hanging loose past his shoulders. His expression betrayed nothing of his thoughts, but there was no malice there, only observation, careful and measured. Anna swallowed, her throat raw and aching. When she tried to speak, her voice came out as a rasp. Who are you?" The man did not respond immediately. Instead, he reached for something beside him, a small bowl fashioned from clay, and offered it to her with a gesture that needed no words. She hesitated, her hands trembling as she accepted the vessel. The liquid inside was hot and fragrant, steam curling from its surface. She lifted it to her lips and drank cautiously, her eyes never leaving him. The broth was simple but nourishing, its heat soothing her throat and easing the tightness in her chest. She drank greedily, her hunger overcoming any suspicion. When she had finished, she lowered the bowl, her fingers still wrapped around its cool surface. "Running bear," he said at last, his voice smooth and deep. the syllables rolling with a cadence unfamiliar to her ears. He spoke English well, but she sensed it was not his first language. Anna nodded, uncertain whether to offer her own name. Caution had kept her alive thus far, but there was something about the way he watched her, a patience she had never encountered before, not even among the few friends she had left behind when she'd fled her old life. "Anna," she whispered, her voice thin and fragile. Anna Klein. His gaze flickered, a subtle acknowledgement of the introduction, but if her name meant anything to him, he gave no indication. Instead, he gestured toward her legs, his brow creasing with concern. Following his gaze, she looked down to find her ankles scraped raw, the skin torn and bloodied from her frantic flight through the forest. Without a word, he rose and crossed the small clearing to where a leather pouch lay upon the ground. He knelt beside her, holding the pouch open so she could see its contents. Dried herbs, their scent sharp and medicinal, mingled with strips of clean linen. His hands moved with practiced ease, grinding the herbs into a paste before applying it to her wounds with gentle precision. Anna winced, but did not pull away. His touch was steady, careful. Nothing like the brutal hands she had grown accustomed to. A part of her wanted to flinch, to recoil from the kindness she did not trust. Yet exhaustion held her in place, her limbs too heavy to fight what little aid he offered. "Thank you," she murmured, her voice low but sincere. Running Bear inclined his head, his expression unreadable. The silence stretched between them, thick with the weight of unspoken questions. Anna fought against the urge to fill it with words. Instead, she watched him, trying to piece together the man who had saved her from the brink of death. His clothing was simple but finely made, a blend of leather and cloth adorned with beads and embroidery that spoke of careful craftsmanship. Around his neck hung a pendant of polished stone, its surface carved with symbols she did not recognize. There was a pride to the way he carried himself, an authority that seemed to flow from him as naturally as breath. "You saved me," Anna said finally, her fingers tightening around the empty bowl. "Why?" Running Bear's gaze remained steady, his eyes sharp and assessing. "You were lost, cold, dying." He spoke the words with a matter-of-fact tone, as though the answer should have been obvious. "I did not wish to see you perish, but—" "You don't even know me." Her voice cracked, a bitter laugh slipping free before she could catch it. "You could have left me there and gone on your way. No one would have blamed you." He considered her words, his expression thoughtful. "Perhaps, but leaving you would have been a cruelty I could not commit." His gaze shifted to the fire, the flickering light casting shadows across his face. "This land is harsh. It demands much from those who live upon it. To abandon another in need is to invite that same cruelty upon oneself." Anna's throat tightened, emotion clawing at her insides. The simplicity of his answer unnerved her, the kindness a sharp contrast to the brutality she had fled. It was difficult to accept that such mercy could be genuine, but he was not her husband, nor one of the men who had hunted her. His eyes held. No anger, no contempt. "Thank you," she repeated, her voice stronger this time. Running Bear inclined his head once more, acknowledging her gratitude with a solemn grace that made her chest ache. There was something regal about him, a dignity that defied the savagery her husband had claimed defined his people. It shamed her to recall the words he had spoken with such scorn, words she had accepted at face value before she had even known what truth looked like. Days passed in a slow rhythmic blur. Running Bear allowed her to rest and recover, his presence a constant but unobtrusive one. He spoke little, but when he did, his words were measured and thoughtful. Hannah found herself listening more than she had ever done before. The silence between them filled with meaning that transcended language. He taught her how to tend to her own wounds, how to forage for edible plants, and craft crude but serviceable tools from the surrounding landscape. She learned quickly, her desperation lending her strength. And through it all, he remained patient, never once scolding her when she stumbled or faltered. His kindness was a balm she had not known she needed. It seeped into her wounds, mending something deeper than torn flesh and bruised bone. For so long she had been nothing but prey, hunted and cornered, stripped of her own will. But here, in this quiet place between the trees, she began to feel something stir within her chest, a sense of possibility, a glimmer of hope. She learned more of him, too. Though he was not prone to lengthy speeches, he spoke of his people with pride and affection. The Comanche, he called them, a name she had only heard whispered in fear and hatred among the townsfolk who clung to the fringes of their territory. But the man before her was no savage. He was intelligent, thoughtful, fierce in his convictions, but never cruel. He hunted with respect for the land, taking only what was needed and wasting nothing. His care for the world around him was evident in every movement, every word he chose to share. One evening, as the fire crackled low and the air grew chill, Anna found herself speaking of her own life. The words came slowly at first, halting and uncertain. But once she began, the dam broke and her story poured forth in a torrent of bitterness and grief. She spoke of her husband's cruelty, his possessiveness that had twisted love into something dark and suffocating. She spoke of her desperation, her hopelessness. Running Bear listened without interruption, his gaze unwavering. When she finished, her voice raw and trembling, he remained silent for a long moment. Then he said, "You were strong to leave. It takes courage to break the chains that bind you." Courage? Anna shook her head. I was terrified. I still am. The sun hung low in the sky, painting the landscape in hues of amber and violet. Anna crouched by the river's edge, her fingers raw from weaving slender reeds into a crude basket. She worked with the determination of someone clinging to purpose, even when her hands ached and her vision blurred from exhaustion. Running Bear had shown her how to braid the fibers, his hands swift and sure as he demonstrated the technique. She mimicked his motions, her attempts clumsy at first but gradually gaining precision. It was something to keep her mind occupied, to tether herself to the present rather than the haunting shadows of her past. He returned from the forest, his presence announced by the soft rustle of leaves and the faint scent of wild sage. She glanced up as he approached, her gaze drawn to the brace of rabbits slung over his shoulder. His movements were fluid, each step measured and confident. She had watched him hunt once, fascinated by the way he moved through the wilderness, as if he were part of it. "Your skill is improving," he remarked, his voice carrying the slightest hint of approval. "Hardly," she replied with a wry smile. "But I'm learning." "Learning is the first step to mastery," he said. "No one is born knowing everything." The simplicity of his words soothed her. Her husband had always been quick to mock her failures, his scorn delivered with the precision of a knife. Here, with Running Bear, she found herself free to make mistakes without fear of ridicule. It was a luxury she had not known existed. As he set about preparing the rabbits for roasting, Anna continued her weaving, her fingers finding a rhythm that quieted her thoughts. It was a rare moment of peace, one she cherished even as unease gnawed at her. Her husband's threats were not so easily forgotten. The memory of his voice, raw and venomous, still clung to her like a disease. She knew he would not give up so easily. His pride would not allow it. Running Bear seemed to sense her unease. As the fire crackled between them, he glanced at her with a quiet intensity that made her feel seen in a way she had never experienced before. "You are still hunted," he said, his words neither question nor accusation. Anna swallowed, her throat dry despite the coolness of the evening air. "He'll never stop, not until he finds me, or kills me." "He will not find you here," Running Bear assured her. "These lands are known only to my people. Outsiders are unwelcome and unprepared for the dangers they bring upon themselves." Conviction in his voice gave her hope, though it did little to ease the dread coiling in her stomach. She had underestimated her husband before. To do so again would be a grave mistake. "If he does find me," her voice trailed off, the words snagging on the weight of her fear. "I don't want to bring trouble to your people. You've already risked too much by helping me." Running Bear's gaze held hers, his eyes dark and unwavering. "Kindness is not weakness, nor is it a burden. You have been wronged. It is only right to offer you refuge." Tears pricked at her eyes, her throat tightening with emotion. "Why?" she whispered. "Why are you helping me? You owe me nothing. And yet you've given me everything." "I do not measure kindness in debt," he replied. "It is given freely, or it is not given at all." The simplicity of his words struck her like a blow, leaving her breathless. Her world had been one of bartered affections and conditional mercy. To be offered something without expectation of repayment was a foreign concept. And yet it was real, tangible, as real as the fire's warmth and the scent of roasting meat. Days turned to weeks, their companionship growing with each passing moment. Anna's strength returned, her body slowly healing from the wounds inflicted by her desperate flight. She learned the ways of the forest, her knowledge expanding under Running Bear's patient guidance. He taught her to snare small game, to recognize which plants were safe to eat and which were best avoided. Their conversations deepened, shifting from the practicalities of survival to something more profound. Running Bear spoke of his people's traditions, their relationship with the land and the struggles they faced as settlers encroached upon their territory. His voice held a quiet sorrow when he spoke of the losses his tribe had endured, but also a fierce determination to preserve what remained. Anna listened, her heart aching with an empathy she had never felt before. The world she had known was narrow, its boundaries drawn by fear and greed, but here, with him, she glimpsed something vast and beautiful, unmarred by the pettiness of her previous life. One evening, as they sat by the fire, Anna spoke of her own past. Her words came slowly, each syllable weighted with pain. She described the lonely farmhouse where she had been raised, her father's death leaving her with little more than poverty and desperation. She had answered the advertisement for a mail-order bride out of sheer necessity, her hope for a better life crushed beneath the heel of a man's cruelty. "I thought marriage would bring me safety," she admitted, her voice trembling. "Instead, it became another kind of prison." Running Bear's expression darkened, his gaze flickering with a fire that matched the flames between them. "The man who hunted you, he is the one who caused you harm." "Yes." The words slipped from her lips like a confession, her shame palpable even now. "He'll never let me go, not until he's destroyed me." "He will not find you," Running Bear said, his voice low and resolute. "And if he does, he will not leave these lands alive." The ferocity of his words startled her, but it also sent a thrill of warmth through her chest. For so long, she had been alone in her struggle. To have someone stand beside her, willing to fight for her safety, was a gift she scarcely knew how to accept. But even as the bond between them deepened, danger crept ever closer. One morning, Running Bear returned from a hunting expedition, his expression grim. "Scouts have reported strangers on our land. Armed men. They search for something, or someone." Anna's blood ran cold, her fingers knotting into fists. "It's him. It has to be." Running Bear's gaze was unwavering. "If it is him, then he has made a grave mistake. My people will not suffer trespassers lightly." "They won't stop," Anna said, her voice cracking. "He'll keep coming, bringing more men. He'll destroy everything just to drag me back." Running Bear's jaw tightened, his eyes burning with a fierce determination. "Then we will show him the strength of those he would seek to conquer." The days that followed were filled with preparation. Scouts were dispatched to monitor the approaching men, their movements tracked with a precision born of generations spent living upon this land. Running Bear trained Anna to wield a knife, his hands guiding hers with careful patience. And as the tension mounted, so too did the bond between them. Their conversations grew deeper, their silences more intimate. Running Bear's kindness had been her salvation, but it was his strength that she clung to now. One night, as they lay beneath a canopy of stars, Anna found herself speaking words she had not meant to voice. "I'm afraid," she admitted, "afraid of losing what little I've found here, afraid of losing you." His hand found hers in the darkness, their fingers entwining with a certainty that startled her. "I will not abandon you, Anna," he said softly, "nor will I allow your past to claim you." And in that moment, she believed him. The morning broke with a haze of mist clinging to the forest floor, silver tendrils curling around the trunks of trees like restless spirits. Anna awoke to the sound of low voices, the cadence urgent, frayed with worry. She rose from her bedroll, her limbs stiff but her senses sharp. Running Bear stood at the edge of the clearing, his shoulders tense as he listened to one of his scouts. Their words were rapid, exchanged with the kind of familiarity born of shared struggle. Anna strained to catch their meaning, her heart quickening with a fear that had grown all too familiar. When Running Bear turned toward her, his expression was grim. "They are coming, your husband, and he is not alone." Her breath caught, her fingers curling into fists. "How many?" "Enough." His eyes met hers, dark and resolute. "But numbers alone do not guarantee victory. They march, blindly into territory they do not understand. And yet they march," she said bitterly, "because they believe their cause is just, that they have the right to take whatever they desire. That is the sickness of their kind," Running Bear replied, his voice heavy with scorn. "Greed, wrapped in righteousness. They'll destroy everything," Anna whispered, her gaze falling to the ground. "They'll burn it all down if it means getting to me. Then we shall make them regret crossing into these lands," he said. "My people are prepared. We will not be caught unawares." "But your people," she faltered, the words tangled with guilt. "They shouldn't have to suffer because of me. This is my fight, not theirs." "No," he corrected, his gaze fierce and unyielding. "It is our fight. You have become one of us, and we protect our own." The words struck her with a force that left her speechless. She had spent so long running, clinging to the belief that she was utterly alone. To be claimed, to be welcomed into something greater than herself, was a gift she had not known how to hope for. "What do I do?" she asked, her voice thin but determined. "How can I help?" Running Bear regarded her with an intensity that made her feel both fragile and powerful. "You have courage, Anna, more than you know, but courage alone will not keep you safe." "I'm tired of hiding," she admitted, her eyes blazing with a newfound resolve. "If they're coming, then let them. I won't be dragged back to that nightmare, not ever again." He nodded, a glint of approval sparking in his gaze. "Then you must fight, not only for yourself, but for all who would see you free." The hours that followed were a blur of preparation and tense anticipation. The camp hummed with activity, warriors sharpening their weapons, children and elders herded to safety beneath the cover of thick foliage. Anna worked alongside them, her hands blistered and her muscles aching, but her spirit unbroken. Running Bear showed her how to string a bow, his hands guiding hers with a patience that only heightened her determination. The weapon felt foreign in her grasp, but she clung to it as though it were a lifeline. If she was to survive, she needed to learn. "Fear is natural," he told her, his voice low and steady, "but it must not rule you. Let it sharpen your senses, not cloud them." "I'm trying," she whispered, her gaze fixed on the distant tree line. "But it's hard to forget how powerless I was, how easily he took everything from me." "You are not powerless now," Running Bear said, "and you are not alone." They stood side by side, their shoulders brushing, and the quiet certainty of his presence lent her a strength she had never known. The fear remained, a coiled serpent in her gut, but it no longer paralyzed her. Instead, it fueled her, urging her forward with a relentless drive. The attack came just before dusk. The first sign was the distant rumble of hooves, the ground trembling beneath the force of their approach. Running Bear's warriors moved with disciplined precision, their movements swift and purposeful as they readied themselves for the coming clash. Anna took her position among them, her heart hammering so fiercely she could scarcely breathe. But she held her bow steady, her fingers curled around the string, her eyes trained on the approaching enemy. Her husband's men emerged from the shadows like phantoms, their faces hard and merciless. She spotted him almost instantly, his figure unmistakable even at a distance. He sat astride a horse, his gaze sweeping the terrain with predatory calculation. When their eyes met, a cruel smile twisted his lips. "There she is," he bellowed, his voice slicing through the air like a blade. "You think you can hide from me, Anna? That you can run from what you owe me?" Anna's fingers trembled on the bowstring, but she refused to lower her gaze. "I owe you nothing," she shouted back, the words spilling from her lips with a fury she could no longer contain. "You're nothing but a coward who preys on the powerless, and I'm not powerless anymore." The taunt provoked the rage she had expected. His face twisted into something monstrous, his grip tightening on the reins. "You'll pay for that," he snarled. "You'll pay for all of it." He charged forward, his men following like a tide of wrath, but they had not expected the ambush that awaited them. Running Bear's warriors descended from the trees with swift, brutal efficiency, their arrows flying with deadly precision. Chaos erupted, shouts and screams mingling with the thunder of hooves. Anna loosed her own arrow, her aim shaky but determined. The projectile flew wide, missing its target, but she refused to let the failure cripple her resolve. She drew another arrow, her breath steadying as she released it into the fray. Running Bear fought with a grace that left her breathless. He moved like a shadow, his tomahawk flashing in the dimming light, his strikes quick and lethal. His warriors fought beside him with equal ferocity, their defense relentless. But her husband's men were many, their desperation lending them a viciousness that could not be easily quelled. The battle dragged on, a brutal, bloody dance that left the air thick with dust and blood. Anna's arms burned from the strain of drawing her bow, but she pressed on, her focus narrowing to the simple act of survival. She could feel her husband's eyes upon her, his rage a palpable force that seemed to twist the very air around them. Then he broke through the line, his horse thundering toward her with murderous intent. Panic flared within her, but she did not falter. She raised her bow, her fingers tightening around the string. Before she could release, a shadow swept past her. Running Bear collided with her husband, dragging him from his horse in a whirlwind of motion. They grappled upon the ground, their bodies locked in a brutal struggle. Anna's breath hitched, her pulse thundering in her ears. She watched, paralyzed by the ferocity of their clash. Her husband's hands closed around Running Bear's throat, his grip merciless. Without thinking, she surged forward, her knife drawn. Her hand trembled as she drove the blade into her husband's shoulder, the force of the strike fueled by all the hatred and pain he had inflicted upon her. He screamed, his grip loosening. Running Bear surged upward, delivering a blow that sent her husband sprawling. His eyes found hers, the gratitude in his gaze wordless but profound. They stood amidst the wreckage of the battle, the air thick with smoke and sweat. Anna's chest heaved, her body shaking from the violence she had unleashed, but she was free, truly free, and she would never allow herself to be caged again.
If this story moved you, like, subscribe, and comment. Share the video, support us with a super chat, or join our memberships to help us create more.